Joining us tonight, Lucan Way, political science professor at the University of Toronto Scarborough campus and co-author of Competitive Authoritarianism. Thabit Abdallah, historian at York University and the author of A Short History of Iraq. Mohammed Tavakuli, professor of history and Near and Middle Eastern civilizations at the University of Toronto. Walid El Khashab, Arabic studies professor at York University. And here's a face we'll all recognize, Janice Stein, director of this Munk School of Global Affairs. Nice to have everybody here tonight. Thanks so much for coming. Janice, I want to start with you because as coincidence would have it, we were in this place last September doing a broadcast on the occasion of the 40th anniversary of Gamal Abdel Nasser's death, and we were discussing Egypt and what the prospects were. My recollection is nobody that night thought what has transpired over the past month would transpire, right?
I agree. Nobody did. Nobody did.
Including
me.
Nobody did?
No.
So how do these things happen when all the best minds in the world don't see them coming?
Well, it's quite interesting, actually, because to see this coming would mean to put a specific date on it. And I don't think anybody did put a specific, and wouldn't have picked 2011, 2012, 2010. There was, however, and this was particularly present in Egypt, really since 2005, the sense that this was a tinderbox and what everybody was waiting for was the spark. Why would I pick 2005? I happen to have been in Cairo when the judges in Egypt went on strike. This is the core of the establishment, and thousands of young people went out into the street to support the judges. And they were texting, and the messages were coming by cell phone, and you could almost sense this was a preview. And I remember thinking to myself, boy, this regime does not have a long life if kids, 19, 20, 21, are willing to go out into the streets to support striking judges. And they were striking because they protested against being forced to certify elections that they knew were rigged.
Were fraudulent, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let me follow up with you because you're born in Egypt, you visit there frequently, you were there last summer. Everybody's trying to figure out what, as Janice suggested, what was the spark that lit the fuse? What do you think it was?
Well, all the people were talking about Khalid Said, who's a young man from Alexandria who was beaten to death by policemen, in broad daylight in the streets. And interestingly enough, the Facebook people who ignited the revolution started by creating a Facebook page called We Are All Khalid Said. But this is only the spark. I mean, things were going bad in Egypt, at least since 2005, as Janice has just said.
Thabit, how about on this? Let's put a couple of things on the checklist, and you rank them for me. Lack of democracy, corruption, economic stagnation. Add anything you want to the mix. What's on the checklist?
All right. Now, nobody could see exactly when it was coming, but there were structural problems that anybody could tell could not continue forever. 1 out of 5 of all the youth in the Arab world have no hope of employment. This is a region where in the past 2 decades has more than doubled its population. It is also a region which has had dictators and authoritarian regimes since the 1970s. I mean, people like Gaddafi, like Mubarak, like the monarchies, like Ali Abdullah Saleh of Yemen, have been around for decades and decades, accumulating enormous amounts of very corrupt money. And now we understand, as these figures are coming out, that they are astronomical. I mean, Mubarak estimated his family, his wealth is estimated at 80 billion.
You believe that?
Gaddafi at 130 billion.
Do you believe these numbers?
I don't know. All right, I don't know if these are correct or not. Perhaps there's exaggerations, there always is. But the fact that these very few families have been ruling the Arab world for so long, accumulating enormous amounts of funds. I mean, Gaddafi's funds could feed the entire Arab world from Morocco all the way to Iraq for the next 3 or 4 years alone.
Mohammed, let me get you.
These things cannot continue. They had to break.
Let me get you again on that checklist. How would you rank them in the order of the thing that actually got this going? Economic stagnation, lack of democracy, corruption. How do you rank them?
Well, the way I would describe it would be that revolutions come, they are not made, and when they come, they don't announce themselves in advance, and often professional revolutionaries are always surprised that a revolution happens. And in this case, I would agree with my colleague Sabit Abdullah that there are institutional, structural problems that have persisted for a long time. These are the institutional problems that created authoritarian states, not authoritarian cultures. And those authoritarian states are serially facing crises, and one after another are collapsing. And my anticipation is that the Gaddafi will go soon too.
Lucan, what would you say?
Well, one point I want to make is that there's a lot of attention paid to the protests, but that's really only one side of the equation. In 2009 in Iran, there were far larger and better organized protests, and the regime held firm. So the question is not just the protest, what caused the protests, but why did the regimes fall so quickly? And why didn't the coercive apparatus do what it was supposed to do? I mean, these are incredibly well-funded coercive apparatus. I mean, the Middle East was supposed to have been able to survive. The autocracy in the Middle East was supposed to be able to survive because it was the coercive apparatus and military was so well-funded. Well, these guys may have been extensive, but they did nothing to save the regime. And I think one thing is that in both Tunisia and in Egypt, you had a relatively professionalized military who had a life outside of the autocrat. So even if Mubarak or Ben Ali falls, they know they have a place to stay.
It's interesting. We're seeing some of the comments from our viewers coming in on the screen right now, and the last one said, let's not get too excited here. Democracy, it's not necessarily a done deal in the Middle East. No. It will take a long time to build, and we're going to explore that theme throughout the course of the evening. Thabit, you wanted to add.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to add here that the military has always has been in existence for a long time, of course, in the Middle East. What has changed, in my opinion, that has brought about an irreconcilable contradiction is the growth of a new entrepreneurial class that is extremely well educated. I mean, now for the first time, as Gaddafi is falling to the wayside, suddenly these incredibly eloquent, very sophisticated Libyans are coming out of nowhere. I mean, Gaddafi had kept the lid on for so long that we didn't even know such a class existed in Libya. There has been a growth of a very sophisticated entrepreneurial class, techno-savvy, very sophisticated in terms of ideas as well, that has been the chief driving engine of these changes. They have been the leaders.
Yeah, just to add to the flip side of what Tabit just said, there is also striking economic inequality. So it's not economic stagnation, Steve. I would actually put at the top of that list that you suggested. Because Egypt was growing at 6% a year. It was actually one of the best periods for the Egyptian economy. But unbelievable concentration of wealth at the top, at the same time as poverty continued underneath. So when you're in Cairo, the wealth smacks you in the face. And even the middle class, the techno-savvy people, were aware of the sharp, sharp contradiction that Tabit was talking about, which simply could not continue endlessly.
Waleed.
There's also a generational shift, particularly in Egypt, and a shift in the status of symbols. Often autocrats, such as Mubarak, were compared to pharaohs. Now, for the first time, people dare to not just mock the pharaoh, but insult him, raise their shoes against him, which is an extremely humiliating and insulting sign. So the fear, the wall of fear has been brought down, and people simply are viewing themselves not as children, but as citizens who want to choose their leader.
Thabit, let me ask you one of those politically incorrect questions, but you're accustomed to getting them from me, so here we go. Fuad Ajami, Lebanese-born professor, said this revolution proves wrong those who have claimed that Arabs do not have the DNA for democracy, which is that is a Western-held view in several circles in Western society. My question is, did a considerable number of Arabs believe that too?
During the 70s and the 80s, there was such a horrible gloom that hovered over the Arab world, an incredible sense of pessimism, that we will pass on to our children a life that's even worse than what we have. So to be very honest, yes, in the height of those terrible decades, there were those who began to question that perhaps we simply cannot achieve democracies. But this was being burst asunder by this new class that is emerging all over the Arab world. Those who read what's going on in other places, those who look back on their history. It's not just being affected by what's going on in the West or in Japan or other places, but in the Middle Eastern history itself. I disagree a bit with your introductory remarks that these were regions that had never known democracy and so forth.
When did Egypt know democracy?
You see, look, the question of
Tell me when.
I'll answer you. The question of humanity's strive for greater freedom is one that is as old as civilization. And one can go back into Middle Eastern history and find numerous examples that are extremely invigorating and that give people hope, including in the recent past, say in Egypt after World War II, during the time of the monarchy. There was an incredible growth of parties, of free speech, of elections that were not rigged, which produced some really dynamic...
How long did it last?
It didn't last very long.
30
It
years.
did not last very long. And in Iraq, it's the same thing, by the way. There were periods of democracies which people remember and are
Let me
very
go
proud
to
of.
Mohammed and then Walid.
Yes, oddly enough, recently I found myself to be in agreement with Fouad Ajami now that he has left the power structure in Washington. And he actually has become much more sensible now that he's not accountable to DC. I agree with him that I think the kind of repression that has become culturally characterized is a product of these authoritarian states that were not just product of the Middle East, they were product of a kind of global alliance that fed them and maintained them. And now we are entering a global crisis that these states, these authoritarian states, are becoming incapacitated. That is, they are no longer able to crush their population because we have a different development. And that development has to do with the emergence of a global public sphere that everyone can see what is happening in the streets of...
Well, let me challenge you on that a bit.
Yeah.
No longer able to or no longer willing to?
They are no longer able to. They are no longer able to because of the global alliance, because of Washington, because of the invasion of Iraq, because of invasion of Afghanistan. The European allies of Iraq of Egypt could no longer stand by and let the Egyptians do what they wanted to do.
Walid, you wanted to comment on the democracy in the DNA.
Democracy in Egypt. It's a well-known fact that the first parliament in Africa and the Middle East was established in the 1870s in Egypt.
You think that's a well-known fact? I'm not sure that's that well-known.
It should be.
Well, it should be.
Maybe it is now.
It should be.
It should be well known.
And the tradition of liberal democracy has been going on since the late 19th century until the 50s of the 20th century. And this is why in some parts of the Arab world, people remember that their grandfathers knew what was liberal elections were like. And this is why, it's not about having the DNA of democracy or not. People have traditions, have a bit remote history, but they still remember democracy.
Janice.
Democracy is a very confusing word. And probably Lucan will come in here and help us out. What was so visible in the Arab world in the last 2 months is, first of all, the loss of fear of these governments and their secret police and the mukhabarat and all the other instruments of repression. And I mean, it's striking what's been happening in Benghazi, for example, where unarmed civilians, took on one of Gaddafi's brigades and succeeded. So the fear has gone, and that is a huge moment in the history of any region. Secondly, if you look at the militaries, these were the decisive factors. The fact that in both Tunisia and Egypt, the military refused to fire on the civilian populations. Why? Because the generals were not confident that if they gave the order to do so, those orders would be followed. And that's a big issue. And that's not the global alliance, my friend. That is very much, these are conscript armies. In Egypt, the army is revered. It has never fired on the Egyptian population.
They won't kill their neighbors.
They will not. First of all, they won't kill their own populations. And Gaddafi, that's a very different story. The third thing, if you look at the crowds that have been out in the streets, the Arab streets, what's the refrain? We want our rights. we want freedom, and we want dignity, right? Now, those are pretty core elements in any kind of democratic system. Where the acid test will come, leave aside all the complicated things we know about how hard it is to get there, but where the acid test comes, how do you treat the minorities in your own society? Because that is a key part. And there are deep splits in some of these societies.
Well, let me
that are
follow
gonna
up
be
with Luke
difficult.
on the first part of what you said. And you wrote this book on differing forms of authoritarian governments. How is it that on one day the system is intact? People are afraid to go into the streets. They fear the secret police. They worry about that knock on the door in the middle of the night. And the next day, 100,000 of them are in the central square of the city, and they don't fear anymore. How does that happen?
Well, you know, you saw that in Eastern Europe in 1989. It's because when the minute the sense of fear and this goes away and the sense of possibility emerges, suddenly, you know, the regime can change radically, as happened in Romania in 1989. But I want to add a note of pessimism. You know, one of the things we learned from Eastern Europe, and I've learned from my studies of democratization, is that the fall of the autocrat is not at all the same thing as the creation of a democracy. The fact that Mubarak is gone says nothing about whether or not there are going to be free and fair elections, whether or not you can have a free media. This is a totally separate game.
Although it worked that way in Eastern Europe for the most part.
Well,
did it not?
well, partly,
Yes and no.
but this
Yes
is a
and no.
lesson, right? And that's actually a lesson that bodes ill for the Middle East. Democracy only happened in some places. The fall of communism in Russia ended up in Putin, who's not terribly democratic. I mean, there are elections, but there's also enormous amounts of fraud and harassment of opposition. And what we find in Eastern Europe is that the only countries that really democratized, that really have free and fair elections, are the ones that were offered membership in the European Union. And the European Union was incredibly important. I just don't see anything equivalent in the Middle East. To put it mildly, the relation between the Middle East and the West is rather fraught, I would say, right? And I think that given the fact that the Middle East has there are strong security interests, the West is just simply not going to impose the kind of pressure on these new regimes that's necessary to create democracy.
I want to go to Mohammed on an angle that I'm not sure has been explored very much through this, because most people seem to start the clock on this a few weeks ago. You know, in Tunisia first, and then Egypt after that, and now we're into Libya and Yemen, and on it goes. Some people think we ought to start the clock in 2009 after the elections in Iran. And there are some circles in Iran that are saying, hey, wait a minute, we're not getting enough credit for actually beginning this movement. This is your home turf. Is that a fair point?
Well, Iranian regime wants to claim that this is the continuation of the Iranian Revolution of 1979. Of course, there is another origin, as you indicated, is the Green Movement and protestation after the re-election of Ahmadinejad. And there are connections, actually, that one could see that, you know, the impressive pouring of Iranians into the streets and challenging another kind of authoritarian, this one more ideological authoritarian state, linked to culturally. And in a sense, I would say that it brought to an end Islamism. And that the end of Islamism, in a sense, is the beginning of the kind of movement that we see emerging in the Arab states. What is happening in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Jordan, and in other places, and even in Bahrain, is not a continuation of Iranian model of Islamism. Is actually a post-Islamist development and post-national development that, again, I would like to link to this emergence of a critical public sphere that has been really significant for the energization of the popular protest.
Okay, in which case, let's pick up on what Lucan just described, and that is, let's get into some discussion now about how well positioned, how well primed these countries are for democracy actually taking hold, now that the potential of it at least seems to be there. Okay, Waleed, you first. How does it look?
Well, I mentioned the very long tradition of liberal democracy in Egypt, but there is also the army. I'm not romantic at all about the role of the army. One never should trust the military, any military. But the army can play a role in Egypt that is similar to the role played by the Turkish military, which is a guarantor of secularism, of the basic values of the state without directly intervening in politics. Of course, it happened at one point that the Turkish military mounted coups, but most of the time they're just watching from from afar. And I hope this would be the model in Egypt, because I don't think the Egyptian military will simply completely vanish from a picture.
Thabit, we just saw another email come up. We've seen thousands of these kinds of notes, right, where people say how encouraging it is that people have taken to the streets and how these countries have an opportunity for democracy to take hold right now. But as Lucan says, it could go either way.
No, there's no doubt. Any kind of mass uprising, including the most classic revolutions, like the French Revolution or the Bolshevik Revolution, entail incredible amounts of dangers. They could shift in all kinds of directions. I mean, the French Revolution ended with Napoleon Bonaparte, and the Russian Revolution ended with Stalin. So it's not necessary that it's going to bring the ideal aspirations of the masses in the streets. But I think that there has been in the Arab world an unholy alliance of three major groups that is being challenged right now.
Who are the three groups?
The military, the secret police, the secret service, and the crony capitalists, those who find a way through corruption because of their personal relationship with the dictator or the authoritarian family. These three elements have dominated the Arab world entirely, from one end of it to the other. Now, the mass uprising led by aspiring entrepreneurs who are deeply frustrated by the corruption and the fact that they really can't get into this cronyism, and the fact that they are very disgusted by the fact that you have to pay a bribe and so forth, and they would like a more level playing field, if you will, allied with the masses of impoverished people who see incredible wealth while they're being forced to.
So that's
to
a
find
budding
work.
coalition there, if you like.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The military right now seems to side with the masses in order to clip the wings of the secret police. And in my opinion, this is going to be the chief test. How much of the secret services is reduced in terms of its power?
Janice, there are at least a half a dozen countries in play right now, if you like. Are you making bets on where democracy is going to take roots? I don't mean literally, but you know what I mean? If you had to, where is it likely to succeed? Where is it not?
You know, I'm very guarded, frankly, when I look out. These have been really, as you say, Steve, magical moments, which are going to inspire anybody who knows the Arab world and has watched the Arab world. That having been said, the transition to democracy is a very long process. You mentioned Turkey, Vali. Turkey took 50 years, and the army intervened again and again and again. And frankly, it's only probably in the last 8 or 9 years that we begin to get something that looks like a stable democracy. This is a very long process ahead. And yes, there is the emerging coalition, but the military in all these societies has tremendous vested interests, is running the economy, has businesses from which it is making enormous rents. So they will negotiate and put civilian phrases in front as long as there's an entente cordiale, exactly, and these civilian governments are on a very limited rope.
Okay,
I think we have to be very cautious here.
We're not done on this. People want to kick at it. Mohammed and then Luke.
I would say the chance of success will depend on the kind of institutions that emerge after the collapse of the authoritarian rulers. The question, for example, in Egypt is there going to be a constituent assembly elected by the people, or the military is going to declare who is going to be writing the constitution? The constitution, if that is electoral process, the constitution that is finally drafted will represent the will of the people. And then, if there is an end to this royal presidency that has become fashionable in the Arab world, lifetime presidency, I think if they limit the presidency to 1 term, actually, rather than 2, then you will have the guarantee that these kind of monarchical presidencies do not re-emerge.
Lucan.
I just want to agree with what Janice said. You know, I mean, there was a headline in the New York Times when Mubarak fell, which was, Egypt takes over the military takes over Egypt, ending 30 years of autocracy. Now, there's something wrong with this headline.
That's quite ironic, isn't it?
Right. I mean, normally I would think, the military is behind autocracy, not ending it. And I think, indeed, if you look at the most successful cases of democratization, Poland, Taiwan, Mexico, they've happened over the long haul. And it's in fact the very suddenness of the transitions in Egypt and Tunisia which I find troubling. Because to have a democracy, you need a strong civil society, you need a strong opposition. That doesn't happen in a few weeks.
Yes, but Lucan, the conditions of the game have become more favorable now for the struggle toward democracy. And this in and of itself is a major advancement and one that should be applauded.
Waleed wanted in as well.
Last week in Tahrir Square, Liberation Square, tens of thousands of young people were shouting, La askar wa la haramiyya, awzin dawla madaniyya, which means no military, no thieves, we want a secular society. So there is hope. I mean, nobody thinks that democracy will be implemented in a few weeks. And definitely, one should not trust the military presiding over the amendment of the constitution. As a matter of fact, in Egypt, what is going on is simply rewriting of certain articles of the constitution. But the struggle has begun, and a lot of people, particularly those who are interested in promoting democracy, secular values, are working on the net, in the streets. There is a petition that actually started with my wife, who's professor at the University of Ottawa, Maytan Nisani. It's called Towards a Secular Society. And we have, until now, 250 intellectuals, university professors, who signed this petition calling on the ruling elite in Egypt to change Article 2 of the Constitution, which states that the principal source of legislation is the tradition of Muslim jurisprudence. We want a secular constitution where everybody is equal in front of the law.
Okay.
So, things are happening.
Stand by, everybody, for a second. I'm going to do a little business just to remind everybody we're at the Munk School for Global Affairs tonight on the downtown campus of the University of Toronto, our home away from home on the last Thursday of every month for us here at the agenda. And we're considering the question tonight of whether or not democracy can be imported, whether or not it can take hold in all of the countries that have been so much in play in the last few weeks in the Middle East and Northern Africa. We want to remind you that Mike Miner is moderating an online chat. Go to tvo.org/theagenda. You've seen some of the comments come up on the screen throughout the course of the evening. Twitter.com, #YourAgenda also is a possibility for that. And also a reminder that at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, after we're done on television, flip over to the web, tvo.org/theagenda. We'll have our post-program web chat, at which time you can put your comments and questions to our guests. I want to do something now that I don't think we've done on any of our programs, and we've done a lot of them on the historic events of the last month, and that is, I'm going to quote an Israeli politician. Here's Tzipi Livni, today in the Washington Post, this is the opposition leader in Israel, who says, she says, in the best case scenario, the wave sweeping across the region will enable democracy to take root in the Arab world, not merely as a government system, but as a values system that embraces nonviolence, coexistence, freedom, opportunity, and equality. The free world has long recognized that democracy is about values before it is about voting. In the 1930s, Europe showed that a democratic process divorced of values can have devastating results. Since then, democratic nations have enshrined the idea that democracy is more than elections and that those seeking to be elected must commit to key democratic principles. Janice, how relevant a distinction is that?
No, she's making an important point, frankly, and I think everybody here would agree. So I think we want to distinguish between the processes, right? I would hope in Egypt that we're going to have a free and fair election. I'm confident that we will. The larger questions are, how does the Egyptian government, the new Egyptian government, deal with its Coptic minority, which has had a very, very rocky road in Egypt over the last 20 years. What happens in a state like Bahrain, where there is a Shia majority and a Sunni minority?
Well, can I follow up on the first thing you said? Because a Muslim cleric by the name of Sheikh Usama al-Qasi has been shown on YouTube saying he has no problem with a Christian becoming the president or prime minister of Egypt.
Well, that's
progress, eh?
That's huge, and it speaks to exactly what Waleed was speaking about. And here I'm more optimistic than some of the pessimists. Let me put it to you that way. And again, because if you listen to what's happening in the streets and you read the social media and the kind of thing that you're talking about, Waleed, there is a consistent demand for equality, rights now. And a secular society, which doesn't mean what it means here, but it means respecting different religions within the overall context of Islam in this part of the world. It's going to be very tough for militaries when they know the population is no longer afraid, right? And that's the crucial issue.
Well,
and they disband this 1.7 million Secret Service police that was in the employ of Mubarak. 1.7 million guys on the payroll to enforce terror, right? That's the one I'm watching. What are they going to do with that organization?
That's a real stake in
If
the
that one
status quo as well.
goes, then I think we have much more grounds for optimism.
Waleed, I don't mean this to sound as smart alecky a question as it's going to sound, but do you think young Egyptians are open to taking advice from Israeli politicians on this issue?
I don't think
No.
any young people from any country are happy about other countries patronizing them. I think the best thing we can do in the West is to listen. I'm reminded of this British intellectual who was speaking at a rally in solidarity with Egyptian, and he addressed the Prime Minister of Britain saying, the British Prime Minister is lecturing us on British values. I am interested in Egyptian values. Well, we don't have to learn from Egyptian values, but at least we have to be respectful towards others. And to get back to the question of minorities, of course, the question of minorities in the Middle East and in the Arab world is a serious one. But we have seen tens of thousands of Christians celebrating a mass in Tahrir Square, in Liberation Square, surrounded by hundreds of thousands of Muslims with not a single incident. To give a North American comparison, that's like having 10,000 Muslims performing a collective prayer in Times Square in New York. I don't think we see that in the U.S.
Lucan, let me try this with you. We just had an email come up on the screen that said, I sure hope that the Arab world doesn't take after our form of democracy if that means increasing cynicism, apathy, and lack of turnout. How much of an issue is that?
You know, the thing about democracy is that it is what it is, and it's pretty good. And it doesn't give you growth. It doesn't eliminate corruption, but it means that you don't have Secret Service knocking in the middle of the night. And we have to be realistic about what democracy can give us. And I think part of the problem is what we have now is that people think that are too optimistic, and their optimism is likely to be destroyed. So I think the important thing is to focus on process.
Mohammed.
I want to go to this question of democracy as a value system. I do think it's a value system, but it's a value system that must be embedded in the state institutions. The reverse of it that I'm really opposed to is the assumption that the Middle Eastern Arabs are undemocratic and they have undemocratic DNA. I think I'm totally against that. But I think if we want to see democracy emerging, it's very important for allies of Egypt, allies of Tunis, future allies of Libya and other states, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, enforce the embodiment of democratic values in the state institutions. Because when you have a very powerful secret police and military that puts you in prison, you cannot aspire those fancy ideas, and you cannot pour into the Liberation Square and Freedom Square every day.
Sure. Janice, then Thabit.
One quick point that we haven't talked about at all is how you manage the expectations. And we're talking about cynicism. How you manage the expectations of these young people. Many of them some were demonstrating for democracy and freedom and rights. Some also said, I want a job. Yeah, I have no hope of employment. I want a job. I can't get married because I can't afford to rent a room anywhere in Cairo, so I can't move out. I want a job. Now, no government within any conceivable formation is going to be able to meet those expectations in the short run. And that is an issue that has swamped nascent democratic governments in the past.
Thabit.
That's a big one.
For sure. I'd like to return to your question about and to Waleed's comment, which I agree with, that any kind of comments from outside are liable to backfire in many ways.
Not helpful, eh?
No.
Yeah, well, sometimes they are, but they have to be very cautious. We just saw an example of that today, I'm afraid, in the Toronto Star with an op-ed by Harun Siddiqui, which I found really quite preposterous.
What didn't you like about it?
Well, we haven't been talking very much about Libya, and he writes an op-ed piece, and he's quite eloquent, and I agree with much of what he writes, suggesting that Libya should be divided into two countries, and equating Libya with the Sudan, with the situation in Sudan, which is absolutely preposterous. This is exactly the kind of dangerous intellectualism or pseudo-intellectualism that actually could be extremely harmful. There's not a single leader in Libya that is calling for this, not a single voice that is emerging that is suggesting any kind of division between East and West. We heard this kind of stuff when the Americans were first moving into Iraq, of the division of Iraq into 3 countries, etc. And it has caused innumerable suffering and has been an obstacle in the stabilization and the development of Iraq.
Mohammed,
this kind of writing, in my opinion, is something that should be avoided.
Well, I don't want to put words in Siddiqui's mouth. He can speak for himself. But given the way the country is, in fact, dividing right now, with the protesters in control of some of the eastern parts, and, you know, could an argument be made that you'd...
and the West.
Well, okay, but could you make an argument that you'd avoid a lot of bloodshed if you just said, Gaddafi, you go west, and the
I
protesters
think
take
as
over
of
the
his
east?
days are numbered, and he's going to, maybe hours or less than few days that he's going to go, and I don't think suggesting something like this would be very
Okay.
favorable.
Let me read something here. This is, Michael's second quote, if we could, here. This is the head of Tunisia's Higher Political Reform Commission, who warns that, quote, we might lose our freedom because we become too drunk on freedom. The risk is that everyone says what they want and does not think of the common good. Walid, how big a risk is that?
Well, it's the risk with any spontaneous revolutionary movement. When do you stop? And I think we should trust the wisdom of the people. In Tunisia, in Egypt, and in other parts of the Arab world, there are those who believe that the revolution should be an ongoing process, and others who believe that we should get back to some order. And I think it's a matter of negotiation. I mean, do we go back to order with the military ruling and having a few ministers changed? Or do we go to a revolution where every day, like in Tunisia, the key word is dégage. Every 2 days they say dégage and they out someone. Of course, this is not helpful, and I think there is a middle ground.
Let me get you to comment on something that's very unusual. The street cleaning in Tahrir Square. Everybody got together and cleaned up the streets.
It was phenomenal.
What'd you make of that?
I think it's amazing. I mean, I've lived in Egypt for 33 years, and this is simply something unprecedented. But it tells a lot about the sense of ownership and the sense of pride that people are taking in this revolution. They feel the country belongs to them, and they want to clean it. Actually, there was this uneducated young man on BBC saying exactly these words. This is our country. We're proud of it. We want to keep it clean. It says a lot about the development of civic sense.
Well, Walid Ghonim, the Google executive who was in prison, then he got out, he put the note on Facebook to people and said, keep cleaning the streets.
Yeah.
And they are.
Well, you know what? It's actually, I think, an unbelievably important both signal, symbol, and message. Because what it says is, this is public space. We care about it. We're responsible for it, right?
Maintain it.
That's right. We need to maintain it. And this is, again, something, if you look at these societies, there was no public space. There was no space where people could go and dissent. There was no space, really, where they felt free to call their own. So the fact that they would, voluntarily organize cleanup days. I always say the measure of a society, how clean are the washrooms where people aren't looking? And if people pick up paper and put it in a basket and keep public space clean, that tells you have an engaged citizenry.
Okay, now I'm going to take it from this high optimism that I'm hearing from most of you throughout much of the evening, and we're going to bring it right down into the gutter. Here we go. This is the Pew Research Organization. Walid, you've been waiting for this. December 2010, public opinion surveys. Now, Pew's a pretty reliable organization. I think we'd all agree on that. But they did a survey on views of punishment, and they compared 4 countries, Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey. Michael, let's bring these numbers up. To punish or not to punish? Stoning for adultery, that's category 1. In Egypt, 82% of those surveyed said yes. Jordan, 70%. Lebanon, 23%. Turkey, 16%. Next category, cutting off hands for theft. 77% approval in Egypt, 58% in Jordan, 13% in Lebanon and Turkey.
Big change.
The death penalty for leaving Islam as a religion. 84% in Egypt, 86% in the kingdom, 6% in Lebanon, 5% in Turkey. We're all talking about Egyptians as being, with the democracy in the DNA. And these numbers, Walid, would suggest something very different. What do you want to say?
I think this survey is as credible as the one claiming that 82% of Egyptians live in pyramids, ride camels, and raise crocodiles in their backyards. I think we have more serious issues to deal with than these figures.
You don't believe the numbers?
I mean, you can believe the numbers about Turkey. 13%, this represents those who believe in radical, violent types of brands of Islam. The fact that you have 82% in Egypt, so claims the survey, believing in Sharia law, simply means that the people who did the survey in Egypt need more training, that's all.
Okay, Mohammed.
I would say this is foul question, and actually
which?
foul question is a bad question to ask, and it's not really the right question to ask, because the kind of question that reproduces the stereotypes of the Middle Easterners as undemocratic. And there are many other kind of questions that one could ask that would gauge the democratic values and the people's commitment to democratic values. But asking the Sharia-based kind of questions, I don't think those are the type of questions that one should be asking.
Lucan.
Yeah, I actually want to criticize it from another end. I think it's actually the talk about democratic values is a little dangerous in the sense if we start blaming Middle Eastern authoritarianism on popular authoritarian values, it's like blaming the victim for the crime.
Precisely.
Authoritarianism is overwhelmingly imposed on people. Very rarely do you have a referendum saying to the Iraqis, do you want a democracy or do you want an authoritarian regime? No, it happens through a military coup. And in fact, the political scientists have not been able to find any strong relationship between support for democracy and successful democratization. So I think we want to sort of think more about, in a sense, who cares what the values are? What's important is the nature of the state.
Who cares what the values are?
Of the population.
Who cares?
In the sense that the population, that's not how regimes are determined. It's determined by it's determined by the elites.
Well, I got to tell you, and Thabit, let me come to you on this. One of the things that I'm, in the course of doing your research you hear out there is, okay, it all looks good for Egypt right now, but 82% of the people there believe in stoning for adultery, and 77% of the people believe in cutting off people's hands if they're caught being thieves. This is not going towards democracy. This is going somewhere else.
I don't know how accurate these figures are, but I do believe that there is this danger, for sure. And I think there is still a hanging cloud over the Arab world, especially over the Arab world, that a strong Sharia could actually interfere with democratization. And I believe that this is something that in the process of revolutionary transformation, these figures will change.
Okay,
in other words, if the question is asked today, you might get a different answer.
Lucan, you want a quick hit on that?
Exactly. The values are oftentimes a reflection of the institutions, not the other way around.
I'm not excusing this. I do believe this is something to be worried about, and something that the Democrats must struggle against and to transform.
Just a quick one. This is a reputable. These are reputable surveyors and their experience. So I actually don't dismiss the results, and I think there's real contradictions here. And I think one of the really fascinating things to watch is I'm in favor of freedom, I'm in favor of rights, I'm in favor of equality, and I'm in favor of stoning people who commit adultery. Right. And it's not obvious to people that those are deeply in contradiction. Right. Now, they are. How is, in fact, the new leadership in these societies going to navigate very tough waters? And that's, I think, what everybody's going to be watching for.
Okay, guests. Back here, we got some questions in the audience. Less than 10 minutes to go. Go ahead, sir.
Even after the autocratic president was ousted on January 14th, a lot of young and underemployed individuals in Tunisia are fleeing to Italy looking for jobs. So how does the interim president in Tunisia keep the morale high in a place where they're being economically challenged at this point?
Tough question. Anybody? Janice, you want
that? That's the one that's the one that worries me, frankly, which is the jobs issue, because the expectations, the experience has been so heady, frankly, for people who have displayed enormous courage and brought down regimes. But for many of these young people, the fundamental issue is jobs. And it's not possible for the new Tunisian government. The most freely elected new Tunisian government cannot produce the kinds of jobs that are necessary when you have 40% unemployment. That's the kind of average unemployment for young people under 25 in Tunisia and Egypt.
Thabit?
Now, what happens? To these young people are disillusioned.
Let's go faster here. Thabit?
Sorry, but I agree with what Janice said, and I think this is an extremely important question. What will change, however, is not that jobs are going to be prevalent, but that the solution, that the struggle to find jobs is a collective one, that the nation elects officials, it has a certain transparency as to what's happening with the finances. It can no longer blame the system or a certain family for the failure of getting jobs. They will now look internally at a collective failure and a collective solution, a search for a collective solution.
Right here, please.
Yeah, hi. As the reforms, the democratic reforms have swept throughout the Middle East into Northern Africa, do you think this trend is going to continue down south and eventually we'll see a more democratic Central Africa?
Mohammed, what do you say on that?
I certainly hope so. That this is contagious, hopefully, and will catch others. Particularly Saudi Arabia. I'm waiting for that moment.
Walid,
That'll
go
be
ahead.
the big moment.
Well,
that would be the big moment.
Speaking of Africa, Libya has been playing an extremely important role in Africa. And if democracy prevails in Libya, then definitely there will be a domino effect in other sub-Saharan African countries.
Over here, please.
So it seems like the main question that we should be engaging with rather than perpetuating stereotypes is what are the concrete steps necessary to build a democracy? We know a lot about that from the democracies that have been built. So what are the concrete steps that need to be taken in order to ensure a democracy is built?
By whom? Can I ask who you mean?
But in terms of the steps taken?
No, I mean, who you're saying, what are the concrete steps that need to be taken by whom?
By the people running the government, by the people. I mean, what needs to happen from the international community, from the local community?
Well, this is it. This is two different questions. And maybe we can get into some of this. Let's break this down. Lucan, to you first.
Okay. What was important in Eastern Europe was intense Western engagement. That, the Middle East is very similar to, in some ways, much of the former Soviet Union because in both regions you have a very little tradition of democracy. So what made democracy possible was long-term Western engagement that helped ensure that elections were free and fair and that media was free. But at the same time, I'm just not sure that's possible given the fraught relations between the West and the Middle East.
Janice, what about Western countries? What do Western countries need to do?
Well, let me, just before I get to that one, the first concrete step, delay the elections. All right, as long as you can. The rush to elections in 3 months, 6 months, frankly, is a big mistake. There's very good research that shows that you need to allow political parties time to organize. You need to be able to let civil society organizations develop. So in Egypt, there is a tremendous push right now to an early election. I think that would be a big mistake. What could Western democracies do?
Well, actually, before you get there, what kind of signal does it send to the world if in the push for democratization, the first thing you do is delay elections?
Well, that's probably, the optics are not great, but in fact, if you want a better result, you actually want to delay the elections 18 months and allow organization and allow rules to be put in place and political parties to
Let the army
form.
run the show for 18 months?
Well, you have a caretaker government that's acceptable, a national unity cabinet, which is, I think, the second thing that should happen in these countries that represents the different opposition parties, and you delay these elections.
Okay, let me get Thabit and then Walid.
Janice, I think that the Iraq case is very instructive
Yeah.
here. I'm a great believer that essentially democracy is built from the grassroots, that the key to democratic stability is a strong civil society with non-governmental organizations, elections on local levels. And this is what should have happened in Iraq. Local elections can be done rather quickly. And that will give a comfort to Democrats that, in fact, the military is not running everything. And then with time, we move up to a national.
Walid, 18 months? You want to wait that long before you have elections in Egypt?
It depends on the conditions. I agree with Thabit and Janice. We need to have in place an education about civil society and democracy, for example, in Egypt. And I think people are more interested in removing the emergency law governing Egypt than in having new democratic elections. However, there is a balance that we should strike between our views in the West about the things the Egyptians should do and the people in Egypt want to do.
I think these authoritarian states have come down because of vibrant civil societies, and those vibrant societies are able to elect, deputies who can rewrite the constitution. I would say that's the first step. The first step is to have a constituent assembly, rewrite the constitution, and then have a presidential election, have parliament parliamentary election, and I am fully confident that the people in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Libya, and other places in the Middle East do have that capability because they are part of the very vibrant civil society.
Let me get one more question, and we got time for
Thanks. Do you think that is there any chance of a revolution in Saudi Arabia in recent time?
Lucan, Saudi Arabia?
I have no idea.
Inshallah.
Inshallah, you say? Thabit, Saudi Arabia?
Well, this has been an Arab affair so far. And this is very interesting. It's a new form of pan-Arabism, that is a people's pan-Arabism rather than one imposed from the top. So I'm not that confident that it's going to spread into sub-Saharan Africa. But the Saudi case is a tough nut to crack. I can't say that we should be surprised with anything anymore in the Arab world. I never, ever imagined that something like this could happen in Libya, which was so tightly controlled.
Although, Janice, you know...
So who knows?
You don't hear...
it is possible. My answer is it's possible.
On the list of countries, you tend not to see Syria or Saudi Arabia.
No, and for different reasons. Syria, because it is a ruthless, probably the most frightening police, and the government of
So is
Syria...
Libya, Janice.
Well, but the government of Syria
Saudi
actually
Arabia.
killed 25,000 people of its own in 1985, and people were... Saudi Arabia is a really interesting case. It's actually got one of the most supple systems because people fan out in their town halls every week.
Or maybe it's out of our sphere. No one covers it. No one knows what is happening in
That's not
Saudi
true.
Arabia.
That's not true.
give-
There's very good scholarship.
We got
That's
20
not true.
seconds left. Waleed, why don't you
There's
take
a trivial thing. It's about the age of dictators. The Saudi king is 80 and more. Mubarak was 80 and more. Syria is different. The dictator is, I think, 45 or something.
Yeah,
so
but
he
his
has
family's
time.
been in office a very, very long time,
You know, I
since
would just say,
1970.
I can tell by the enthusiasm level of our guest tonight that you are not done talking about this, and it's just as well because we're not done with you yet. We're done on television, but we're not finished with everything. So thank you to our guests. Stand by because we're not finished yet. Thank you to our audience who has come from near and far this evening to be with us.